It was a bright Saturday morning, and Jamal woke up feeling the warmth of the sun peeking through his window. He stretched his long arms, reaching up to the ceiling, feeling the gentle pull of his muscles. Jamal was tall for his age, only 16, but already towering over many of his friends. His friends sometimes joked that he was built for basketball, and Jamal couldn't help but smile at that. Basketball was his passion. He lived and breathed it, spending hours on the court, practicing his moves and dreaming about making it big one day. This Saturday, however, was different. It wasn't going to be about basketball. Jamal had promised his mom he would run a quick errand to the store for her. She needed a few things for dinner, and he agreed to help without thinking twice. It was supposed to be simple. A short walk to the store, grab the groceries, and head back. Easy, right? As he stepped outside, the neighborhood was quiet. The birds chirped in the trees, and the air was fresh and clean. Jamal loved his neighborhood. It was peaceful, filled with families who'd lived there for years, kids playing in yards, and people who waved at each other when they passed by. This place was home. As he walked, he thought about his future and how, one day, he hoped to make his mom proud. Maybe he'd even be able to buy her a new house in a nicer neighborhood. Jamal walked with his headphones on, listening to his favorite music. The beat was steady, and he found himself moving to the rhythm, lightly tapping his fingers against his side. Music and basketball, two things that made him feel alive. Sometimes he'd even imagine himself on a big stage, a basketball star with fans cheering for him. These daydreams made him smile as he walked down the quiet streets. Soon, he reached the store. It wasn't a big store, just a small neighborhood market with everything they needed. He pulled out the list his mom had written for him, reading through it carefully. She had written it in her neat handwriting, each item with a little checkmark box beside it. Milk, bread, pasta, and tomato sauce. He mumbled to himself, nodding as he read each item. The store was calm. Only a few other people were shopping, mostly older folks who came here every Saturday morning. Jamal moved through the aisles, picking up each item carefully, making sure he had the right brand and size. His mom was particular about these things. She always said, "Jamal, if you're going to do something, do it right." He respected that, and he wanted to make sure he got everything she needed. He reached for the milk, his long arm stretching to the back of the cooler to get the coldest carton. Just as he did, he noticed someone watching him. He looked up, surprised. Standing a few feet away was a woman, probably in her 40s, with a stiff posture and a purse clutched tightly under her arm. She was looking at him with narrowed eyes, as if trying to figure something out. Jamal felt a bit uncomfortable, but he quickly looked away, focusing on his list again. Maybe she was just browsing, he thought. Maybe she didn't mean anything by it. People looked around all the time, right? He tried to ignore it and moved to the next aisle, humming softly to himself to shake off the strange feeling. But then he noticed her again, standing at the end of the aisle, watching him. This time, there was no mistaking it. She was definitely looking at him. Jamal felt his face grow warm. He wasn't sure what he had done to catch her attention, but her stare was making him uneasy. He kept his head down, focusing on his task, picking up the pasta and tomato sauce his mom wanted. He moved to the checkout line, hoping that would be the end of it. But the woman followed, standing a little too close behind him, her eyes never leaving him. Jamal could feel her gaze on the back of his neck, and it made his skin crawl. He tried to ignore her, keeping his focus on the cashier as he paid for the groceries. As he left the store, he let out a sigh of relief, hoping she would stay inside. But to his surprise, the woman followed him out, still clutching her purse, her eyes sharp and suspicious. Jamal tried to keep calm, his mind racing. Why was she watching him like this? He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just a teenager picking up groceries for his mom. He decided to walk faster, hoping she would go away. But she kept her pace, not too far behind him. The street was quiet, and he felt alone, wondering if he should say something or just keep walking. His heart began to beat a little faster, and he took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm. Then he heard her voice, loud and clear. "Excuse me, young man," she called out. Her tone wasn't friendly. It was sharp and demanding. Jamal stopped in his tracks, turning around slowly. There was no one else around, and he realized that she was talking to him. "Yes, ma'am," he replied politely, hoping that would ease whatever tension she seemed to be feeling. He wasn't looking for trouble. He just wanted to get home. "What are you doing around here?" she asked, her voice filled with suspicion. She glanced at his grocery bag, as if it held something dangerous. Jamal was taken aback. He had never been questioned like this before, especially not in his own neighborhood. He looked at her, confused. "I'm just picking up some groceries for my mom," he said, trying to keep his tone calm and respectful. She narrowed her eyes, clearly not convinced. "You don't look like you belong here," she said coldly, her gaze piercing. The words stung. Jamal felt a knot form in his stomach. He had lived in this neighborhood his whole life. His friends, his school, his memories, they were all here. This place was as much his home as anyone else's, and yet here was this stranger telling him he didn't belong. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I live just down the street," he said, pointing in the direction of his house. "My mom asked me to get these things for dinner tonight." But she didn't budge. Instead, she took a step closer, looking him up and down with a cold, scrutinizing gaze. Jamal felt trapped. He wanted to walk away, to escape her judgmental eyes, but he didn't want to cause a scene. He could feel his heart pounding, his pulse quickening. He tried to think of what his mom would tell him to do in a situation like this. She'd probably say, "Stay calm, be polite, and don't let anyone make you feel small." The woman glanced down at his bag again, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then, as if reaching some decision, she pulled out her phone and dialed a number. Jamal watched, frozen, as she raised the phone to her ear. His mind raced. Was she really calling someone? And if so, who? "Hello, yes, I'd like to report something suspicious," she said into the phone, her eyes still fixed on Jamal. Jamal's heart sank. Suspicious. What had he done that was suspicious? He was just trying to get home with groceries for his mom. But here he was, standing in his own neighborhood, being watched and judged, and now reported to the police. He couldn't believe this was happening. He stood there, unsure of what to do. Should he walk away? Should he stay and wait for whatever was going to happen next? His mind was a swirl of confusion and frustration. All he wanted was to go home, but now it seemed like that simple plan had turned into something much more complicated. Jamal picked up his favorite snack and held it in his hand, smiling a bit to himself. It was a small treat, something he didn't always get to have. His mom would sometimes tell him he was too old for snacks, but he couldn't help it. It reminded him of the fun times he used to have with his friends, hanging out after school, sharing snacks, and laughing over little jokes. He could almost hear their voices now, teasing him about his love for this particular snack. He chuckled to himself, feeling at ease. But then suddenly, he felt something strange. It was as if someone was watching him, like he could feel their eyes on his back. At first, he brushed it off. Maybe he was imagining things. After all, it was just a regular day, and he was just a regular kid buying some snacks. Why would anyone be watching him? He continued down the aisle, picking up a few more things his mom needed. He grabbed a box of pasta and some tomato sauce, all the while humming quietly to himself. He tried to focus on the list in his hand, but he couldn't shake the strange feeling. It was almost like a chill running down his spine, and it made him feel uneasy. Jamal glanced around casually, trying not to seem nervous. His eyes scanned the shelves, the products neatly lined up. And then, there she was. A woman, maybe in her 40s, stood a few steps away. She was staring right at him, her eyes narrow and cold, her lips pressed tightly together. She looked serious, too serious, in fact, for a simple trip to the store. The woman didn't look away, and that made Jamal's stomach tighten. He looked down at the box of pasta in his hand, pretending to be focused on it, but he could still feel her gaze. It was as if she was studying him, trying to figure something out, but he had no idea what. He tried to ignore her and turned to walk down the next aisle. Maybe she would go away, and he could finish his shopping in peace. But as he moved, he saw her step forward, still looking at him. It was as if she was following him. Jamal's heart started to beat a little faster. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just there to get groceries, just like everyone else. So why was she acting this way? Jamal moved to the snack aisle again, thinking maybe he could shake off the strange feeling if he just focused on something else. He reached for another bag of his favorite snacks, letting out a soft sigh to calm himself. But as he looked to the side, he saw her again. She was standing at the end of the aisle, still watching him with that same sharp, suspicious look. Feeling braver, Jamal looked up and met her gaze for a moment. He tried to smile politely, hoping she would realize he was just a normal kid. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice steady but a bit wary. He didn't want to sound rude, but he wanted her to know that he had noticed her watching him. Instead of answering, the woman clutched her purse tighter, holding it close to her body as if she thought he might take it. Her face didn't soften. In fact, she seemed to frown even more deeply. She didn't say a word. She just stood there, looking at him like he was someone dangerous, someone she didn't trust. Jamal felt his cheeks grow warm with embarrassment and frustration. He didn't understand why she was acting this way. He was just there to buy groceries, just like everyone else. He wasn't doing anything unusual, wasn't making any noise, and wasn't causing any trouble. Why did she seem to think he was? He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself down. His mom always told him to stay calm in situations like this, to be polite and respectful. "People might judge you before they know you, Jamal," she would say. "But don't let that get to you. Just be yourself, and keep your head high." He repeated those words in his mind, using them as a shield against the uncomfortable feeling growing in his chest. He looked down at his list again, trying to focus on his task. Milk, bread, pasta, tomato sauce. He mumbled to himself, double-checking to make sure he hadn't forgotten anything. He was almost done. Just a few more items, and he could go home. But the woman didn't move. She was still there, still watching him with that same intense look. Jamal's hands started to feel clammy. He didn't want to give her any reason to think badly of him, so he moved carefully, making sure not to knock anything over or make any sudden movements. He felt like he was walking on eggshells, just trying to get through the aisles without drawing more attention. As he picked up a loaf of bread, he glanced over his shoulder again, hoping she had finally looked away. But no, she was still there, standing just a few steps behind him. This time, her expression looked even colder, almost as if she was waiting for him to make a mistake, to do something that would confirm whatever suspicion she had. Jamal's heart began to pound even harder. He wanted to say something, to ask her why she was following him, but he didn't want to cause a scene. He wasn't sure how she would react, and he didn't want to make things worse, so he kept quiet, moving slowly, focusing on the list, hoping she would eventually lose interest and leave him alone. But she didn't. She followed him to the dairy section, where he picked up a carton of milk. As he reached out for it, he noticed her take a step closer, clutching her purse so tightly that her knuckles turned white. He could feel her eyes boring into him, and it made his skin crawl. He felt trapped, like he couldn't move freely, like he had to prove he was innocent, even though he hadn't done anything wrong. He tried to remind himself that he was in the right. He was just shopping, following his mom's list, minding his own business. But the way she was looking at him made him question himself, made him wonder if he was somehow doing something wrong without realizing it. He felt a mix of anger and sadness bubbling up inside him, but he tried to push it down. As he turned to head toward the checkout counter, she followed, staying just a few steps behind. Her gaze never wavered, never softened. It was like she saw him as something less than human, something to be feared or avoided. Jamal didn't understand why. He didn't know this woman. He had never seen her before in his life. So why did she look at him like he was a threat? When he finally reached the checkout line, he hoped she would stop. Maybe she would go down a different aisle or leave the store entirely. But no, she stayed right behind him, still clutching her purse, still watching him with those cold, judging eyes. The cashier, an older man with a friendly smile, greeted Jamal as he approached. "Good morning, young man. Did you find everything you needed?" Jamal nodded, trying to focus on the cashier's friendly face and ignore the tension building behind him. "Yes, sir," he replied quietly, placing his items on the counter. He could feel the woman's gaze on his back, and it made him feel exposed, vulnerable, like he was standing in the middle of a spotlight with nowhere to hide. As the cashier rang up his items, Jamal noticed the woman taking out her phone. She was still watching him, but now her fingers were moving quickly across the screen. He wondered what she was doing. Was she texting someone about him? Or maybe she was taking a picture. The thought made him feel even more uncomfortable. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He turned around and looked directly at her, his expression a mix of confusion and frustration. "Ma'am, is there something wrong?" he asked, his voice steady but strained. The woman looked surprised, as if she hadn't expected him to say anything. She blinked, then narrowed her eyes again. "I'm just making sure everything's fine," she replied, her tone icy and defensive. Jamal frowned. "I'm just buying groceries," he said softly, his voice filled with a quiet frustration. "I'm not doing anything wrong." But the woman didn't seem convinced. She glanced down at his bag, her eyes lingering on each item, as if she was searching for something suspicious. "You're awfully young to be out here alone," she muttered, almost to herself, but loud enough for Jamal to hear. Jamal felt a wave of indignation wash over him. He was 16, more than old enough to go to the store by himself. He had done this countless times before without any problems. So why was this woman acting like he was doing something wrong? The cashier, sensing the tension, cleared his throat and handed Jamal his receipt. "Here you go, son," he said with a kind smile. "You have a good day now." Jamal took the receipt and nodded gratefully, appreciating the cashier's friendly demeanor. He started to walk away, hoping to finally put this uncomfortable experience behind him. But as he headed toward the exit, he heard the woman's voice again. "Excuse me," she called out, her tone sharper now, more demanding. Jamal stopped and turned around, feeling a mixture of anger and exhaustion. He just wanted to go home, to put this entire encounter behind him. But it seemed like the woman wasn't done with him yet. "Are you sure you paid for everything?" she asked, her eyes narrowing as she looked at his bag. Jamal felt his heart sink. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Yes, Mom," he replied, his voice quiet but firm. "I paid for everything." She didn't look convinced. Instead, she looked him up and down, her gaze full of suspicion. "I just want to make sure," she said, her tone cold and untrusting. Jamal took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He didn't want to make a scene. He didn't want to give her any reason to think he was doing something wrong. So he held up his bag, showing her each item carefully, one by one. Jamal took a deep breath, trying to let go of the tension building inside him. He wanted nothing more than to go home, to walk away from this strange, uncomfortable situation and get back to the safety of his own neighborhood. But the woman, the one who had been watching him since he walked into the store, seemed determined not to let him go that easily. Her eyes were fixed on him, and Jamal could sense her suspicion, even without looking directly at her. It was there, in the tight lines of her face, in the way she clutched her purse as if he might take it at any moment. He had done nothing wrong, nothing to make her feel afraid or suspicious, but somehow that didn't matter. To her, he was out of place. He didn't belong, and she was determined to do something about it. Just as Jamal was about to turn and leave, she pulled out her phone. At first, he thought she might just be texting someone, but then he saw her tap the screen a few times, and he realized she was making a call. His heart sank as he heard her speaking, her voice loud and clear, cutting through the quiet of the store. "Yes, I'd like to report something suspicious," she said, her tone serious and cold. She glanced over at Jamal, her eyes narrowing as she looked him up and down. "There's a young man here who doesn't look like he belongs. I think you should send someone to check it out." Jamal couldn't believe what he was hearing. His chest tightened, and he felt a mix of anger, sadness, and frustration bubbling up inside him. All he wanted to do was buy some groceries and go home, but now he was being treated like a criminal. He could feel the stares of other people in the store, their curious glances as they tried to figure out what was going on. He took another deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm. His mom's words echoed in his mind. "Jamal, no matter what people say or do, remember who you are. Don't let anyone make you feel small." He repeated those words to himself like a mantra, using them to ground himself, to keep his emotions in check. As he stood there, waiting, he could hear the woman continuing to speak on the phone. She was describing him to the person on the other end, listing off details that made him sound dangerous, even though he was just standing there with a bag of groceries. Her words felt like a slap in the face, a painful reminder that no matter how good he tried to be, there would always be people who saw him as a threat, who judged him based on nothing more than his appearance. Jamal looked down at his hands, noticing how they were clenched into fists. He forced himself to relax, to release the tension in his muscles. He couldn't let her get to him. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing him lose his cool. Instead, he stood there calmly, waiting, his face a mask of quiet strength. The minutes seemed to stretch on forever, each one filled with the weight of the woman's gaze, the judgment in her eyes. Jamal could hear his own heartbeat, loud and steady, as he waited for whatever was going to happen next. He knew the police were coming, knew they would question him, maybe even search him, but he was determined not to let it shake him. He would stand tall, just like his mom had taught him, and he would face this with dignity. Finally, he heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance. The sound grew louder and louder, filling the quiet street outside the store. Jamal felt a mixture of emotions, fear, anger, and a deep sadness that he couldn't quite put into words. But he held his ground, standing there with his bag of groceries, his head held high. The woman looked pleased as the sirens grew closer, a smug smile on her face, as if she had done something noble, something important. Jamal couldn't understand it. Why would she feel proud of calling the police on a kid who was just buying groceries? But he didn't let her see his frustration. Instead, he kept his expression calm, his eyes steady as he looked at her. When the police cars pulled up outside the store, 2 officers stepped out, their faces serious as they approached. They walked toward Jamal, their eyes assessing him, taking in every detail. Jamal felt a chill run down his spine, but he stood his ground, keeping his hands visible, making sure he didn't make any sudden movements. One of the officers, a tall man with a stern expression, looked him over before speaking. "Is there a problem here, son?" he asked, his voice firm but not unkind. Jamal shook his head slowly, his voice steady as he replied, "No, sir. I'm just here to buy some groceries for my mom." He held up the bag in his hand, showing the items he had bought, hoping it would help them see that he wasn't a threat. The woman stepped forward, her voice sharp as she spoke to the officers. "I called because he seems suspicious," she said, her tone filled with conviction. "He doesn't look like he belongs here, and I thought he might be up to something." Jamal felt a surge of anger at her words, but he kept his face calm, refusing to let her see how much it hurt. He glanced at the officers, hoping they would see the truth, that they would realize he was just a kid trying to do a simple errand. The second officer, a woman with kind eyes, looked at him thoughtfully. "Do you have a receipt for those items, young man?" she asked gently. Jamal nodded, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the crumpled receipt. He handed it to her, watching as she looked it over, her eyes scanning the list of items. She glanced up at him, her expression softening as she handed the receipt back. "Everything seems to be in order," she said, her tone calm and reassuring. She looked at her partner, giving him a small nod. The male officer turned to the woman who had called them, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am, it appears that there's no issue here. The young man has paid for his items, and he's done nothing wrong." The woman looked taken aback, her face turning red as she realized that the officers weren't going to support her assumptions. She opened her mouth to protest, but the male officer held up a hand, stopping her. "Ma'am, we appreciate your concern, but there's no reason to assume someone is suspicious just because they look different," he said firmly. His words were calm but carried a weight that made the woman step back, her face flushed with embarrassment. Jamal felt a sense of relief wash over him, but there was still a lingering sadness in his chest. He had done nothing wrong, yet he had been treated like a criminal, judged and accused based on nothing more than his appearance. It was a painful reminder of the world he lived in, a world where people like him were often seen as threats. The female officer looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "Are you okay, young man?" she asked softly, her voice filled with genuine concern. Jamal nodded, forcing a small smile. "Yes, Mom. I'm fine," he replied, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. He was grateful for the officer's kindness, but he couldn't shake the weight of what had just happened, the hurt and frustration that lingered in his heart. The officers gave him a small nod before turning to leave. Jamal watched them go, feeling a mixture of gratitude and sadness. He was thankful they had treated him fairly, but the experience had left a mark on him, a painful reminder of the world's injustices. As he turned to leave, the woman who had called the police looked at him, her face still red with embarrassment. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but then she closed it, looking away. Jamal didn't say anything to her. There was nothing he could say that would make her see him differently, nothing that would change her mind. He walked out of the store, his head held high, refusing to let her make him feel small. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, he took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs. He was stronger than her judgment, stronger than the prejudice he had faced, and he knew that he would rise above it, just as his mom had always taught him. As he walked home, he thought about what had just happened, about the pain and frustration he felt, but he also felt a sense of pride, a pride in knowing that he had handled it with dignity, that he hadn't let her make him feel any less than he was. He thought about his mom, about the strength she had instilled in him, the resilience she had taught him. She had always told him that people might judge him, might see him differently, but that he should never let it change who he was. He knew she would be proud of him for how he had handled himself, for staying calm and strong in the face of injustice. When he finally reached his house, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. Home was his safe place, the one place where he could be himself without fear or judgment. He walked inside, setting the groceries down on the kitchen counter, and took a deep breath, letting the tension finally leave his body. As he stood there, his mom walked into the room, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Hey, Jamal, how was the trip to the store?" she asked, her voice warm and welcoming. Jamal hesitated for a moment, wondering if he should tell her what had happened. But as he looked into her eyes, he knew he couldn't hide it. She would understand, would know exactly what to say to help him make sense of it all. "It was interesting," he replied, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He told her about the woman, about the police, about the judgment he had felt. She listened quietly, her eyes never leaving his face, her expression filled with empathy and understanding. When he finished, she placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch gentle but strong. "I'm so proud of you, Jamal," she said softly. "You handled that with grace and strength. You showed them who you are, and that's all that matters." Jamal felt a surge of pride at her words, a warmth that filled his chest and chased away the lingering sadness. He knew that he was stronger because of her, because of the lessons she had taught him, the strength she had given him. As they stood there together, he felt a sense of peace, a knowledge that no matter what challenges he faced, he would always have her by his side, guiding him, supporting him. And he knew that he would continue to face the world with strength, with dignity, and with pride, just as she had taught him. Jamal stood there on the sidewalk, his mind racing but his body calm. The police officers had just told him he wasn't in trouble, but he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He kept his hands visible, breathing deeply to keep his mind steady. He felt a mixture of emotions, confusion, frustration, and a little bit of fear. The officers, who had taken a step back, seemed to be deciding what to do next. They hadn't left yet, and neither had Karen, the woman who had called them. She stood nearby, her face red with anger and embarrassment, still clutching her purse as if she couldn't let go of the tension she had brought into this situation. Jamal's mind drifted to his mom. If only she were here, he thought. She'd know exactly what to do, how to make things right. She always knew how to handle tough situations with grace and strength. He didn't want to bother her, though. She was probably busy with work or some important meeting. After all, being the mayor of the town came with a lot of responsibilities. Just then, he heard the familiar sound of a car engine, a smooth and steady hum. He looked up, and to his surprise, he saw a sleek black SUV turning onto the street. His heart leaped when he recognized the vehicle. It was his mom's car. The same car she drove to City Hall every day. The car he'd washed with her on weekends, listening to her stories about her work and the people she helped. As the car pulled up to the curb, Jamal felt a wave of relief wash over him. The officers and Karen looked over as well, their expressions shifting from curiosity to surprise. The black SUV came to a stop, and the driver's door opened slowly. Out stepped a woman with a strong, confident presence, dressed in a well-fitted suit that spoke of professionalism and authority. Jamal's mom looked around, taking in the scene with calm, assessing eyes. She stood tall, her posture straight and poised, exuding an air of quiet power that demanded respect without saying a single word. Her gaze moved from Jamal to the officers, and then to Karen, her expression unreadable but intense. Karen's face paled as she realized who had just arrived. Her mouth opened slightly, and she seemed to shrink back, gripping her purse even tighter. The officers exchanged quick glances, clearly recognizing Jamal's mom as well. They shifted their stance, their expressions turning more respectful. Jamal felt a surge of pride as he looked at his mom. She had always been his role model, someone he admired deeply. She wasn't just his mom. She was a leader, a voice for fairness and justice in their town. And now, here she was, standing beside him when he needed her the most. "Mom," Jamal greeted her with a calm smile, feeling a sense of comfort wash over him. Just saying that word made him feel stronger, like everything would be okay now that she was here. His mom nodded at him, a small, reassuring smile on her face. She reached out and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, a silent gesture that spoke volumes. Then she turned her attention to the officers, her gaze steady and unwavering. "Good afternoon," she said in a polite but firm tone. Her voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable authority in it. "Is there a problem here?" The male officer cleared his throat, looking slightly uncomfortable. He glanced at his partner, who gave a small nod, as if encouraging him to speak. "Well, Mom," he began, choosing his words carefully, "we received a call about a situation, but everything seems to be in order now." Jamal's mom raised an eyebrow, her gaze shifting to Karen, who was standing a few steps away, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "I see," she replied, her voice cool and measured. "And who made this call, if I may ask?" The officers hesitated, glancing in Karen's direction. Karen shifted uncomfortably, clearly feeling the weight of Jamal's mom's gaze. She looked down, avoiding eye contact, as if hoping to disappear into the background. Jamal's mom didn't wait for an answer from the officers. She turned her full attention to Karen, her expression calm but unyielding. "Ma'am, I understand that you called the police because you thought my son was suspicious," she said, her tone polite but carrying an edge that left no room for excuses. Karen looked up briefly, meeting Jamal's mom's gaze for a split second before looking away again. I thought he didn't belong here," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "I was just trying to be careful." Jamal's mom took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving Karen's face. "Careful?" she repeated, her tone steady. "I calling the police on a young man who was simply buying groceries." Karen's face turned even redder, and she seemed to shrink under the weight of the question. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. Instead, she looked down at the ground, her embarrassment and discomfort clear for everyone to see. The male officer, sensing the tension, cleared his throat again. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Jamal's mom, "we apologize for the misunderstanding. Your son has done nothing wrong, and we can see that now." Jamal's mom nodded, her gaze still steady. "I appreciate that, officer," she replied. "But I would like to remind everyone here that assumptions can have serious consequences. My son should not have to feel like a suspect simply for existing in his own community." The officers nodded, their expressions solemn. Jamal could see that his mom's words had made an impact. They stood a little straighter, as if recognizing the importance of what she was saying. Karen, on the other hand, looked like she wanted to be anywhere but here. She shifted uncomfortably, her face red with embarrassment and regret. She glanced at Jamal's mom, then at Jamal, her eyes filled with an uneasy apology. Jamal's mom took a step closer to Karen, her expression softening slightly but still firm. "Ma'am," she said gently, "I understand that we all want to feel safe in our community, but that safety should not come at the expense of judging others unfairly. My son deserves to be here, just as much as anyone else." Karen nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the ground. She looked like she wanted to say something, maybe an apology, but the words seemed to stick in her throat. She shifted her feet, looking more and more uncomfortable by the second. Jamal watched his mom, feeling the deep sense of pride and admiration. She had taken control of the situation, standing up for him with grace and strength. She hadn't raised her voice or shown anger. She had simply spoken the truth, calmly and clearly, and it had left everyone in silence. The female officer looked at Jamal's mom with a nod of respect. "Thank you for your words, ma'am," she said quietly. "We'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Jamal's mom gave a small nod in return. "I appreciate that, officer," she replied. Then she turned to Jamal, giving him a warm smile. "Let's go home, Jamal." Jamal felt a wave of relief wash over him as he nodded. He took a step toward his mom, feeling a sense of comfort and safety that only she could provide. Together, they began walking back to the car, leaving the officers and Karen standing in silence behind them. As they reached the car, Jamal's mom opened the door for him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. He climbed into the passenger seat, feeling the tension of the day start to melt away. His mom got into the driver's seat, and for a moment, they sat in silence, the quiet hum of the engine filling the air. After a moment, his mom looked over at him, her eyes filled with warmth and pride. "I'm proud of you, Jamal," she said softly. "You handled yourself with grace and strength. You didn't let anyone make you feel small." Jamal felt a lump in his throat as he looked at her, a mixture of gratitude and admiration filling his chest. "Thank you, Mom," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. He didn't need to say anything else. She understood, as she always did. As they drove away from the store, Jamal looked out the window, watching the familiar streets pass by. He felt a sense of closure, a feeling that he had come through something difficult and emerged stronger on the other side. He knew that he would face more challenges in the future, more moments of unfair judgment and misunderstanding. But he also knew that he would never face them alone. His mom would always be there, a source of strength and guidance, helping him find his way. And as they drove home together, Jamal felt a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to keep moving forward, to stay true to himself, no matter what. As Jamal and his mom walked back toward the officers and Karen, the air felt different. Jamal could feel the shift, a sense of quiet respect following his mom as she approached. Her presence alone seemed to make everyone more aware, more alert, and even the officers straightened up a bit. Karen, on the other hand, looked uncomfortable, more than uncomfortable. Her face was red, and she was biting her lip as if she was unsure of what to say or do. She couldn't meet Jamal's mom's gaze, her eyes darting to the ground as they came closer. Jamal could almost see the tension in her posture, her shoulders drawn tight, her hands clutching her purse even now. The two officers were standing nearby, looking a bit awkward as they glanced between Karen and Jamal's mom. It was clear they understood who she was. Everyone in town did. As mayor, she wasn't just a public figure. She was respected and admired by many. She had built a reputation for fairness, for standing up for everyone in the community. And now, here she was, standing calmly and confidently, ready to speak the truth with dignity and grace. Jamal's mom looked at the officers, nodding politely. "Officers, thank you for coming," she began, her voice steady but soft. "I understand you were responding to a call, but I hope now it's clear that there was no need for this to escalate." The male officer cleared his throat, looking slightly embarrassed. "Yes, ma'am. We're sorry for the misunderstanding," he said, his voice respectful. He glanced at Jamal, his eyes reflecting a mixture of regret and apology. "It's clear now that there was no issue here. We apologize if we caused any distress." Jamal nodded politely, trying to let the officer know he accepted the apology, but he could still feel the sting of the experience, the way it had made him feel judged, as if he were a stranger in his own town. He didn't say anything, though. Instead, he focused on his mom, knowing that she would say what needed to be said. After a brief pause, Jamal's mom turned to Karen, her expression calm and thoughtful. Karen looked away, unable to meet her eyes, clearly uncomfortable under the weight of the silence that had settled around them. "Ma'am," Jamal's mom began, her voice gentle but firm, "I understand that you might have had concerns, but I hope you can see now that your actions were based on assumptions." She paused, letting her words sink in, giving Karen a chance to absorb the weight of what she was saying. Karen's face flushed even deeper, and she opened her mouth to say something but seemed to think better of it. She looked down, fidgeting with her purse, her discomfort evident. It was clear that she was beginning to understand, beginning to feel the impact of her actions, and Jamal could almost feel a sense of justice in that moment. Jamal's mom continued, her voice steady and calm. "My son deserves to be here as much as anyone else," she said, her tone unwavering. "He's a good young man, and he was simply here to buy groceries, just like anyone else in this town." She paused, looking directly at Karen, her gaze kind but unyielding. "I'd ask you to consider what assumptions you're making, because they tell a lot about you, not him." Karen shifted uncomfortably, her gaze still focused on the ground. She muttered something, barely audible, her voice tinged with embarrassment. Jamal couldn't quite make out what she said, but he could tell it was an attempt at an apology, however weak or hesitant. Jamal's mom didn't press her for more. Instead, she simply nodded, a gentle acknowledgement of Karen's discomfort. She didn't need to force an apology from her. The lesson had been delivered, and that was enough. Jamal felt his mom's hand on his shoulder, a comforting weight that seemed to ground him. She gave him a reassuring squeeze, a silent message that everything was okay now, that they had come through this together with dignity intact. Jamal looked up at her, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He felt a surge of pride, not just in her, but in himself too. He had faced this challenge, stood his ground, and now, thanks to his mom's strength and grace, he felt a sense of closure. The officers took a step back, clearly ready to leave, their expressions respectful as they nodded at Jamal and his mom. "Thank you, Mom," the female officer said quietly, her tone filled with genuine respect. "We appreciate your words. It's a good reminder for all of us." Jamal's mom gave a small nod in return. "Thank you, officers. I trust that we all understand each other now." With that, the officers turned to leave, their steps quiet as they made their way back to their car. Karen lingered for a moment, still looking down, her face red and her shoulders tense. She looked up briefly, her eyes meeting Jamal's for a split second. And in that moment, Jamal saw a hint of regret, a spark of understanding in her eyes. Jamal wasn't sure if she would change, if she would learn from this experience, but he hoped she would. He hoped that maybe, just maybe, she would think twice before judging someone else, before making assumptions that could hurt others. His mom looked down at him, her expression warm and proud. "Ready to go, Jamal?" she asked, her voice gentle. Jamal nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "Yes, Mom," he replied, his voice steady. Together, they turned and walked away, leaving Karen standing alone in her discomfort and shame. As they walked, Jamal felt a deep sense of satisfaction, a feeling that justice had been served, not through anger or confrontation, but through quiet strength and truth. His mom had handled the situation with grace, showing Karen the impact of her actions without tearing her down. It was a powerful lesson, one that Jamal knew he would carry with him for a long time. They reached his mom's car, and she unlocked the doors, opening the passenger side for him. Jamal climbed in, feeling the comfort of the familiar seat, the warmth of the car's interior a welcome contrast to the tension of the past hour. Once they were both settled in, his mom looked over at him, her eyes filled with pride. "You did well, Jamal," she said softly. "You stayed calm and respectful, even when you had every reason to feel hurt. That shows real strength." Jamal felt a lump in his throat as he looked at her, a mixture of gratitude and love filling his chest. "Thanks, Mom," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't need to say anything else. She understood, as she always did. As they drove away from the store, Jamal looked out the window, watching the familiar streets pass by. He felt a sense of peace, a feeling that he had come through something difficult and had emerged stronger on the other side. He knew that this experience would stay with him, that it had changed him in a way he couldn't fully understand yet. But he also knew that he was not alone, that he had his mom by his side, guiding him, teaching him to stand up for himself with dignity and respect. And in that moment, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for her, for the strength and wisdom she had given him. As they neared their neighborhood, his mom reached over and gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze. "Remember, Jamal," she said softly, "you don't have to prove yourself to anyone. You know who you are, and that's all that matters." Jamal nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. Her words filled him with a sense of confidence, a reminder that he was enough, just as he was. He didn't need anyone's approval or validation. He was proud of who he was, and he wouldn't let anyone make him feel otherwise. They pulled into the driveway, and Jamal felt a sense of relief as he looked at their home, the place that had always been his safe haven. They got out of the car, and as they walked up to the front door, his mom looked over at him, her eyes filled with warmth. "I'm proud of you, Jamal," she said again, her voice soft and sincere. "You showed real courage today." Jamal felt his heart swell with pride as he looked at her, a mixture of gratitude and love filling his chest. "Thank you, Mom," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. They walked inside together, the warmth of their home surrounding them, a comforting reminder of the love and support that would always be there for him. Jamal knew that he would face challenges in the future, that there would be more moments of judgment and misunderstanding, but he also knew that he would never face them alone. And as he stood there, looking around at the familiar surroundings of his home, he felt a deep sense of peace. He knew who he was, knew that he was strong and capable, and he knew that, no matter what, he would always have his mom by his side, guiding him, supporting him. In the days that followed, Jamal found himself reflecting on the experience, on the strength he had found within himself and the lessons he had learned. He realized that his mom's words had stayed with him, a constant reminder of his worth and his resilience. He thought about Karen, about the look of regret in her eyes as they left. He wondered if she had learned something too, if she would think twice before judging someone else in the future. He hoped she would. He hoped that maybe in some small way, this experience had opened her eyes, had shown her the impact of her actions. But whether she changed or not, Jamal knew that he had grown from the experience, that he had learned something important about himself and the world. He knew that he would face challenges in the future, but he also knew that he was ready, that he had the strength and the wisdom to navigate them with dignity and grace. And as he walked through his neighborhood, surrounded by familiar faces and places, he felt a renewed sense of pride in who he was. He was Jamal, a young man with dreams, with courage, and with a mom who had taught him the true meaning of strength. In the end, he knew that was enough. And as he continued to move forward, he carried that lesson with him, a quiet strength that would guide him through whatever challenges lay ahead. The next few days were quiet but thoughtful for Jamal. He went back to his regular routine, going to school, practicing basketball, and spending time with friends. Yet even as life returned to normal, he found his mind drifting back to that day at the store. The memory lingered like a small pebble in his shoe, something he couldn't quite shake off. It was more than just what had happened. It was the feelings that came with it. The confusion, the frustration, and yes, even the hurt. He hadn't done anything wrong, yet he had felt like a stranger in his own town, judged and misunderstood. But as he thought back on that day, he also felt something else: pride. He was proud of how he had handled himself, how he had stayed calm and respectful, even when others hadn't shown him the same courtesy. And most of all, he was proud of his mom, who had come to his side and defended him with grace and strength. She had shown him, once again, the power of standing up for yourself without losing your dignity. One evening, as Jamal sat on the porch, looking up at the stars, his mom joined him. She brought out 2 mugs of hot chocolate, one for each of them, and sat down beside him with a gentle smile. They sipped in comfortable silence for a moment, enjoying the quiet of the evening. The night was cool, and the air was fresh, filled with the familiar sense of their neighborhood. It was peaceful, and Jamal felt a sense of calm settle over him. After a while, his mom turned to him, her eyes warm and thoughtful. "I've noticed you've been quiet lately," she said softly. "Are you still thinking about what happened at the store?" Jamal nodded, his gaze fixed on the stars above. "Yeah," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I keep thinking about it, about why it happened. I didn't do anything wrong, but it still hurt." His mom reached over, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "I understand, Jamal," she said gently. "It's natural to feel that way. Sometimes people judge us based on things they don't understand. They see only what's on the surface and forget to look deeper, to see the person behind the appearance." Jamal nodded slowly, letting her words sink in. "But why, Mom?" he asked, his voice filled with quiet frustration. "Why do people judge each other like that? Why can't they just see the person for who they really are?" His mom took a deep breath, her gaze thoughtful as she looked out at the night sky. "It's a difficult question, Jamal," she replied softly. "People often judge because they're afraid, or because they don't understand. Sometimes it's easier to make assumptions than to take the time to get to know someone. But that doesn't make it right." She looked at him, her eyes filled with warmth and pride. "You have a choice, Jamal. You can let their judgment make you feel small, or you can rise above it. You know who you are, and that's what matters. Don't let anyone make you doubt your worth." Jamal felt a warmth in his chest at her words, a sense of strength and comfort. His mom had a way of making him feel understood, of helping him see things in a new light. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his worries begin to lift. "Do you think things will ever change?" he asked, his voice filled with quiet hope. Do you think people will stop judging each other based on appearances? His mom smiled, a gentle, understanding smile. I believe that change is possible, Jamal, she replied. But it starts with people like you. By staying true to who you are, by showing kindness and respect, even when others don't, you set an example. And maybe, just maybe, people will see that and begin to change their own ways. She paused, her gaze thoughtful. Change doesn't happen overnight, but every act of kindness, every moment of understanding makes a difference. It's like planting seeds. You may not see the results right away, but over time, those seeds grow into something beautiful. Jamal looked at her, a spark of hope lighting up in his eyes. So, by being myself, by treating people with respect, I can make a difference. Yes, Jamal, his mom said, her voice filled with pride. You may not realize it, but you have the power to make a difference just by being who you are, by challenging those biases, by showing others that there's more to a person than meets the eye. You're helping to build a world that's more accepting, more understanding. They sat in silence for a moment, each lost in thought. Jamal felt a sense of purpose growing inside him, a feeling that he could do something meaningful just by staying true to himself. It was a simple idea, but a powerful one. A reminder that change starts with small actions, with everyday choices. After a while, his mom gave him a reassuring smile. Sometimes people don't see what's right in front of them, Jamal. But that doesn't mean you have to prove yourself to anyone. Just keep being you, and let them learn their own lessons. Jamal nodded, feeling a renewed sense of confidence. I will, Mom, he replied, his voice steady. I won't let anyone make me feel less than I am. I know who I am, and that's enough. His mom smiled, her eyes filled with pride. That's all I could ever ask for, Jamal. Just be true to yourself, and the rest will fall into place. In the days that followed, Jamal carried those words with him. He felt a sense of peace, a quiet strength that helped him move forward. He knew that he would face challenges in the future, that there would be times when people would judge him unfairly. But he also knew that he had the power to rise above it, to stay true to who he was, no matter what. He began to see his own worth in a new light, to understand that he didn't need anyone else's approval to feel valued. He was enough, just as he was, and he wouldn't let anyone make him feel otherwise. As he walked through his neighborhood, as he practiced on the basketball court, as he laughed with his friends, he felt a sense of freedom, a feeling that he was no longer carrying the weight of other people's expectations. He was Jamal, a young man with dreams, with courage, and with a family who loved him. And that was all he needed to be. Over time, he noticed small changes around him. His friends began to pick up on his quiet strength, his sense of self-worth, and it inspired them too. They looked up to him, respected him for his resilience, and Jamal realized that his mom had been right. By being true to himself, he was setting an example, planting seeds of change. One afternoon, as he was leaving basketball practice, a younger kid approached him, looking a bit nervous. The kid looked up to Jamal, his eyes wide with admiration. Hey, Jamal, the kid said shyly. I just wanted to say that I think you're really cool. You don't let people get to you, and I think that's awesome. Jamal felt a smile spread across his face as he looked at the younger kid. Thanks, he replied warmly. Just remember, you're enough, just as you are. Don't let anyone make you feel like you have to prove yourself. Be true to yourself, and the rest will fall into place. The kid nodded, his face lighting up with a smile. Jamal watched him walk away, feeling a sense of pride and fulfillment. He realized that he was already making a difference, one small act of kindness at a time. As he walked home that day, Jamal felt a sense of purpose, a feeling that he was part of something bigger. He knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, that there would still be moments of misunderstanding and judgment. But he also knew that he had the strength to face them, to rise above them, and to inspire others to do the same. In the end, Jamal realized that his mom had given him the greatest gift of all, the knowledge that he was enough, just as he was. He didn't need to prove himself to anyone, didn't need to seek approval or validation. He was proud of who he was, and that was all that mattered. And as he continued on his journey, he carried that lesson with him, a quiet strength that would guide him through whatever challenges lay ahead. He knew that he would face moments of judgment, but he also knew that he had the power to rise above them, to stay true to himself, and to make a difference in the world, one small act at a time. With each step he took, Jamal felt a sense of freedom, a feeling that he was finally at peace with himself. He was no longer defined by other people's expectations or judgments. He was Jamal, a young man with dreams, with courage, and with a heart full of kindness.